Hello, everyone, and welcome to GBMT 1009. We're in week 4 now, uh, and today we're going to talk about Canada and the world. Remember that in a few weeks, we're also going to have our first test, and your media assignment is due this Friday at 6 p.m. So keep that in mind. I'll put another announcement up on the blackboard, but please keep in mind that your second assignment, your media assignment, is due this Friday. I will not be accepting assignments that do not have the academic honesty statement attached to the assignment that's submitted to turn it in. You must copy and paste this form into your assignment when you turn it in to turn it in. So I will not be accepting them over email. I did last time, but this time there should be no confusion that you will be submitting it to your Turnitin with the assignment. It will obviously affect your Turnitin score, and I'll mention this again at the end of this lecture so we can really remind everyone, but I will not be accepting them through email this time. Everything has to go through Blackboard. I've been told by my superiors as well, so keep that in mind. I have no say in this matter. It has to go through and Turnitin. Okay, well, let's get started for this week. So our agenda this week, we're going to take a little look at Canada. We have looked at hard and soft power in the media. Now it's time to look at Canada's role in geopolitics. Um, we will look a little bit about look at Canada's history very briefly, as well as trade. This isn't a history course, but we will be giving you a little bit of background in Canadian history. We'll discuss hard and soft power and how Canada fits into this hard and soft power paradigm, as well as the geopolitical issues Canada faces. And while this is focused on Canada, this does give us a little bit of insight into the various geopolitical issues that impact various countries. So in this way, Canada kind of serves as a case study in which how we're going to study geopolitical issues more broadly. So I think this is a useful week for everyone as well, even though you might not be interested in Canadian politics, or you might think that this is not relevant to your studies. I think it provides a useful case study. We will go over the media assignment near the end that I put up on the weekly learning last week. Reminder that it's due again this Friday. So it's very important that you do to take a hard, long look at it today and make sure that you are following all the instructions in detail, because many had some difficulties following the instructions in previous assignments. So you have to carefully read the instructions before you start your assignment and take notes. So make sure that you're following all the instructions to a T, APA format. Again, submitting your academic honesty statement to the assignment, making sure that remember that word count, and it doesn't include reiterating the question. So you have to, the word count does not include the title or you reiterating the assignment questions. It has to be written content that you're putting in. So keep that in mind as well when you're writing your assignments. Okay, so let's take a look at Canada. So when we look at Canada, we have to look at some demographic realities. First, Canada is an enormous country. Its territory is second only to the size of Russia. So it includes many provinces. So it has Newfoundland all the way in the east, all the way to British Columbia on the west, with Southern Ontario in the lower points to the south, all the way up to the north, where you have the Northwest Territories far up in the Arctic region. So it's an enormous landmass, and this is evident when you just look at a map, right? It also has the largest coastline in the world. It's bordered by 3 oceans, the Pacific, the Atlantic, and the increasingly important Arctic, which is becoming increasingly important because of the larger geopolitical issues that are facing various countries due to global warming. And the opening of this Arctic passageway has brought in a variety of different concerns, right? It's become a security concern, especially as tensions rise between Canada and NATO states with Russia. And it's also become a important economic and geostrategic area for various reasons as well, right? Because the resource-rich nature of the Arctic, we don't know. So for trade routes, et cetera. So this is gonna be in a very, very important region. The population of Canada is very small. It's only about 38 million people. I think it's equal to that of Tokyo. So it's a very, very small, it doesn't have a large population. If you compare it to the first largest country, Russia, it has 144 million people. So we can see how much larger Russia is, even though the size difference is not nearly as large as that, but it has, you know, about 4 times as many people as Canada. If you look at the third and fourth largest countries, China and the United States, China has 1.5 billion people, and the US has 329 million people. And China and US being similar in size. So then you have Canada, which is only 38 million people. So this is a very interesting phenomenon, right? We have an enormous country with a very small population. Canada is a country with a lot of space, but some of the space is more useful than others, right? Northern Canada is very sparsely populated because much of it is less inhabitable, and it's very expensive to get resources up there. It's expensive to create population centers up in the northern region. So it's most of the population centers are located in southern Canada. So about 58.7% of the Canadian population speaks English, with about 22% speaking French. And there's various interesting kind of relationships between the French and English Canada, which continues to this day based on these different linguistic regions. We also have an Indigenous population, which makes up about 4.4% of the population. Again, we'll talk a little bit about Canada's history within its Indigenous people too, which is a very dark and sad history as well. Okay, Canada has the 6th highest life expectancy in the world of 83.62 years. It's also an aging population. And what this means is that the population is growing much older, and there's less young people. They're replacing the much older population, which is very high. A similar phenomenon is happening in very many different developed countries, especially Western Europe and United States. You have this aging population. And this is a problem in many ways because we're dependent on immigration to fill in labor shortages, for example, due to this aging population and the fact that the number of old people are vastly outweighing the number of young. And this has the impacts on a variety of things, such as the housing market. So for a country of our size, as well as the labor market. So for a country of our size, we cannot have a declining aging population. So despite the myth that Canadians are very outdoorsy or rural people, most actually live in urban areas. About 81.7% of cities, of Canadians live in cities, and these are mostly near the US border. About 7 million people live in the GTA, and many others live in massive urban centers in each province, right? So you have Calgary, Vancouver, and BC, et cetera. And despite this myth of outdoorsiness, this is where most Canadians live, in major cities. Because of the closeness of these major urban centers to the US, this brings a lot of advantages with trade, for instance, with our largest trading partner and closest ally, the United States. So we have a large trading relationship, and our urban centers kind of, the closeness of our urban centers to the US is not by accident, right? There's 6 time zones in Canada. One is a half time zone in Newfoundland. And if you want a perspective of just how much bigger Russia is than Canada still, it has 10 time zones. So, you know, it's an interesting geographic perspective, the differences there. There's also 10 provinces in Canada. There's BC, British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec, which is the French region, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland. We also have 3 territories in the north. So you have Yukon, the Northwest Territories, and Nunavut, which is the newest territory, and it's run independently of the Canadian state with its Indigenous population. So Canada is also a resource-rich country, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that means and what that means geopolitically as well. You know, whether it be our freshwater resources, our massive amounts of farmland, our oil-rich regions. So this also has is very important for the future of Canadian the future of Canadian geopolitics, right? Because we have a very small population and very resource-rich. Canada is also a diverse and multicultural country, which it's formally multicultural, which means that the country itself doesn't have a monolithic culture that overwrites it's what's often called a fruit cake, where each culture is able to retain its cultural heritage and still be a member of the Canadian community. So that being said, Canada has often failed to respect the rights of its Indigenous population, which is becoming more obvious when we look at the sad history of the residential school system and the mass graves that have been found across Canada in recent years. So these residential schools where children were forced by the Canadian state into often Christian religious schools that told them to forget their own heritage, their own traditions, their cultures, and separate them from their families in order to assimilate them into a white European, Canadian, Christian culture, which are, and this obviously is a form of genocide that the Canadian state did to its Indigenous population. So a very sad and brutal history that's becoming more and more evidence as revelations come forward about this history. Okay, so there's a quick view of the country, a quick snapshot of before. Now we'll talk a little bit about its geopolitical history. So the country dates back to 1867, where the first provinces, Ontario and Quebec, Upper and Lower Canada then, New Brunswick and Nova Scotia formed together as one country. Despite being a country, it was still a dominion of the British Empire. So it had no formal independent authority. It had to go through the British for its laws and its final authority. So, Canada was also taking part in various wars. So in 1899, Canada participated in the Boer War, which was in Southern Africa, to support the British, who were against the two Boer, which are another term for farmer republics that were established to fight British rule. And in World War I, Canada had no choice but to participate in the conflict because we were under British control. And when the United Kingdom decided to declare war during World War I, Canada was forced into that war, and the Canadian state was forced to provide material support as well as soldiers to the war effort, and with a large amount of casualties. So, for example, Canada lost about 60,000 soldiers during this conflict, when the population was only about 7 million people. So this is a huge amount of soldiers killed as a percentage of the population, with various battles such as Vimy Ridge in France being major victories for Canada and still kind of remembered within our National Remembrance Day for our soldiers who died in conflict. And it took a large toll of casualties. So these World War I is a sad point in Canadian history and also a source of pride in the years after when we talk about Remembrance Day, et cetera, these national holidays. In 1931, a really important treaty is developed, the Treaty of Westminster, which brought the courts and foreign policy. It gave Canadian independence of its courts and foreign policy. It still relied on the UK for royal assent, but in 1931, Canada had independent courts and its own foreign policy. And this becomes evident when we look at, in World War II, even though the Canadian independent foreign policy didn't lead to Canada not participating in the UK in supporting the Allied nations and the United Kingdom in World War II, we waited 1 week to join the war effort as a way of showing Canadian independence and the independent foreign policy that Canada had. Even though we were going to support our allies, the Canadian state decided to wait 1 week just as a show of our independence. Is the Canadian independence. And it's interesting also prior to the Treaty of Westminster, in the end of the 1920s, there was a large debate over whether women were legal persons. It seems ridiculous in our day and age, but the ability for women to vote In Canada, it believed that it was not the case that women were actual legal persons. But in the United Kingdom, they voted at this time, women were declared legal persons able to vote. So in many ways it was good, and in doing so, Canada had to follow suit. So in many ways it was good that the courts were not fully independent at that time prior to 1931, because women were actually given the right to vote because we were still a member of the British. We were not fully independent of the British. So it's kind of interesting in that regard. Okay, now following World War II, Canada was a founding member of the United Nations and helped define a new foreign policy, which was largely built around its participation in things like international organizations and cooperation with its international partners abroad. We'll have an entire class in a few weeks about the most important international organization post World War II, which is the United Nations, and we'll go into this in more detail. Canada was also a founding member of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was the Western response to the rise of communism and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. So Canada becomes an active member in the politics of the Cold War, not only for ideological reasons, but also for geopolitical security reasons. So when we look at Canada, we can see the geographic proximity to Russia, which was then the Soviet Union, and how this would impact Canada's security in the case of a conflict. So Canada had an existential reason to get involved in the Cold War beyond just the kind of ideological capitalism versus communism. So it also had to do with these kind of traditional national security concerns about the Soviet Union's hard power and its interests in its proximity to Canada, et cetera. And Canada's, most importantly, Canada's proximity to the United States, where if things were to evolve into full conflict, Canada would obviously be impacted if our largest trading partner and our closest neighbor gets involved in this. There were various debates in the 1950s and 60s about whether Canada should get involved or should get nuclear weapons. We eventually chose not to, becoming a middle power, what's called a middle power, rather than a nuclear great power, right? In 1965, Canada gets its own flag rather than the Royal Union flag. So now we have the same flag to this day with the maple leaf. And in 1970, Canada also had its own domestic conflict with its own nationalists in Quebec, who sought independence from the Canadian state, where the Front de Liberation du Québec, or the FLQ, kidnapped the provincial labor minister as well as British diplomat James Cross. And this led Pierre Trudeau, who is the current prime minister's father, who was then prime minister, to invoke the War Measures Act. In the first time in Canadian history during peacetime, which gave new authorities to the military, et cetera, domestically in Canada at that time. So we can see that Canada has had its own domestic conflicts between its different linguistic and cultural groups. We can see that a cleavage between the Canadian state with its Indigenous and First Nations population over its history of colonization and genocide. We also can see the cleavage between the Canadian state and the French Quebecois, where there continues to be a sovereigntist political party, the Parti Quebecois, which seeks formal independence from the Canadian state. And obviously this would be a geopolitical concern for Canada as well, if you have a breakout nation within its own state. So Canada's had these internal conflicts as well. In 1982, we had repatriation. So this was full independence, a new constitution, and a charter of rights and freedoms. So this is a big year for Canada as well. And it's around this time that the Alberta oil boom also happened, with huge impacts on Canada's development. In Alberta, the oil that's produced there requires processing because of the large amounts of sand in the oil, which is very expensive to do, right? It's not like other regions of oil where it doesn't require as much processing. But as oil became more expensive at this time, it became worth doing it. It became the processing became worth it. It requires lots of water, et cetera, resources to do this, but it became worth it eventually. And in the 1990s, Canada gets involved in peacekeeping missions. including in Somalia, where it was quite disastrous, and where Canadian soldiers, specifically the Canadian 51st Airborne Regiment, murdered a teenager, creating a scandal known as the Somalia Affair. And Canada was also involved in other peacekeeping missions in Yugoslavia, et cetera. But by the 1990s, because of these, these failures in their peacekeeping missions and the kind of disasters that occurred, it really took a hit on Canadians' global image, especially in relation to foreign policy, et cetera, right? Okay. So Canada participated in the first Gulf War in Iraq in the 90s, but not the second. That was the 2003 invasion of Iraq. We chose not to participate because the US decided to unilaterally invade Iraq rather than with the approval of the United Nations. So we'll talk in a few weeks about NAFTA and where Canada, we'll talk a little bit more about NAFTA in a few weeks. I thought I'd just mention it here. Where Canada signs a major free trade agreement with US and Mexico. But post 9/11, we did send troops to Afghanistan to take part in the war on terror in Afghanistan, and which was a very, very long conflict. So if you're interested in the war in Afghanistan, it's a very interesting, very long, the longest conflict post World War II. So very, very long conflict since 2001, only ending last year. Canada's also been involved in the current conflict in Ukraine. Often, Canada's involvement in many of these conflicts is in training missions. And this is largely due to Canada's large Ukrainian population as well. Canada's failed to win a seat on the UN Security Council. If you're not a permanent member of the Security Council, you have to win a seat through the vote. And the Security Council is the highest authority within the United Nations, the kind of final decision makers within the United Nations. We'll go more into the detail about this later. But we've lost 3 UN Security Council votes, indicating that we're not as popular within the international community as we might imagine ourselves to be. Canada has also not met its climate change goals. Even though Canada's had these ambitious climate change goals, it has not met these climate change goals for various reasons. Canada's also performed quite poorly during the pandemic, and it's failed to help its own population, as well as failed to help those abroad, offering a marginal amount of vaccines and supplies to other countries despite pledges. So we can see that Canada's geopolitical history is quite complex. And Canada has tried to carve its own space for itself in its foreign policy and geopolitically. But it's been met with a lot of issues and difficulties, which we're going to discuss in the second part of this lecture. But I think we'll end here for part 1 of this lecture. And then when we come back, we're going to discuss a little bit about Canadian hard power, Canadian soft power, and then we'll talk a little bit about the media assignment. So stay tuned for part 2, and thank you all for listening, and see you all very, very shortly. Bye-bye.